Today I'm going to talk you through how to make a pattern from a pre-existing garment. I will also be making alterations to the pattern, so I'll be adding length to the legs because they're a little bit short for what I would like as a base pattern. And then when I'm cutting out the shorts, I'm going to make an alteration to have a turned down waistband rather than an added on waistband. The first thing I'm going to do is lay the garment onto some paper that I'll be using to trace it onto. I'm just using brown pattern drafting paper, but you can use baking paper or waxed paper, tissue paper, whatever you have available. Once you've placed it onto your paper, pin your seam lines of the garment onto the paper, which will give you a guide for when you lift the garment up to trace around it, so you get quite an accurate line of what the garment is, and then start to trace it out. If you have elastic, as I do in this waistband, hold the side of the edge and then stretch it out so that you can get a more accurate marking of what the width of that pattern piece will need to be. Now you've traced out your pattern pieces, grab a ruler and fill in your lines kind of like dot to dot so that you can see the lines of the pattern that you're going to start working with. Now that you've drawn your first lot of solid lines, I would recommend that you measure each of those lines and then measure where those lines would be on the actual garment. So you have a comparison to make sure that the pattern pieces are the same size of the garment that you are tracing. If there are any differences between the garment itself and the pattern that you're making, you might need to add just a little bit in size-wise to wherever the size differences may be within the garment. I'm using this as an example with the crutch line, but I'll go into a little bit more detail once I'm actually doing that. Once you know that the garment piece is the size that you need it to be, your next step will be adding seam allowances. So I'm adding 1 centimetre to all of my seam lines. You also need to consider your hem, what you're going to do to your hem to finish it. I'm making this as a base pattern, and these shorts are a little bit too short for my liking, so I am adding an extra 4 centimetres. Then from there, I'm going to measure the crutch line of the front and the back of the shorts, write myself some notations, and find out what the difference in length from the front to the back, so I can add some more length on the crutch line of the back panel. Once you've double checked that the size of the pattern is what you need to work out what your grain line is going to be. And this is really important for when you're laying your pattern piece onto your fabric to make sure that your garment isn't going to warp once it has been washed for the first time. The best way to work out your grain line in your shorts when you're making your pattern piece is to fold your hemline so it is square, so that when the pattern piece is folded, it looks like it would be symmetrical if the crutch line wasn't cut out. I will make another tutorial on grain lines, making up grain lines for different pattern pieces and different garments, and how to use your grain lines on your fabric as well. The shorts that I'm using as the template for these patterns, the back and the front pattern pieces are the same except for the crutch line. So what I'm doing is I'm making up the front first, and then I'm going to trace that exact piece onto another piece of paper. Then I'm going to add extra length of the center back, which is the back crutch line, and the amount that I am adding onto that will be the difference between the front and the back lengths that I currently already have. Which means if the front is 20 centimetres on the garment and the back is 25 centimetres, on the piece, the new back piece that I'm making, I'm adding an extra 5 centimetres to the centre back, which is the back crutch line. Your next step is to make sure that your seam lines that you attach together, so that will be your side seam of your front and your back and your inner leg seam of your front and your back, are the same length. And the reason that you need to do this is so when you're sewing them together, you know that they're going to match perfectly. After making your pattern, the next step that you need to do is making up a toile. A toile is a mock-up version of the garment, and you're making it up to make sure that your sizing and your fit are correct. You have a couple of options when it comes to toiling. If you're confident about your pattern, you can toile it up in a fabric, so you're making it up so it is wearable. If it is something that you've never done, or you've never done a toile before, or you've never done a fitting before, I would recommend that you do it in quite a cheap woven fabric if it's a woven garment. Which I can explain a little bit more about woven and knit fabrics in another tutorial if you like. You now need to lay your fabric out to cut your patterns, and the way you're going to do this is you're going to fold your fabric so that your grain lines are nice and parallel with each other. Then you're going to lay your pattern piece onto your fabric, making sure your grain lines on your pattern match your grain lines on your fabric. The other alteration that I'm going to make to this pattern is I am going to have a fold over waistband rather than a attached waistband, and I'm going to do that at the stage of cutting the fabric. So I'm going to lay my pattern piece down, and then I'm going to add my extra 8 centimeters, and the 8 centimeters is going to compensate going up for the waistband, turning over for the waistband, giving me an allowance to fit the width of the elastic that I'd like to use, and then also a centimetre seam allowance. A few tips when it comes to cutting your fabric. One, you need to have very sharp scissors to cut fabric so they aren't hacky on the fabric, and they also don't catch the fabric to distort it under your pattern piece. I would also recommend having fabric scissors that are marked as fabric scissors. The way I do this is I just put a scrap of fabric and tie it around the handle of the scissors. That way it's really obvious which are my fabric scissors and which are my paper scissors. It's also a good idea to have scissor sharpeners on hand, and they are available to buy at a few different places. If you can't find any, just let me know and I can point you in the right direction. It's also a good idea if you're right-handed to cut your fabric pieces out in an anti-clockwise direction. That's so that your body is on the side of the pattern piece, and that's the piece that you're watching. If you're a left-handed, you do the opposite. You cut in a clockwise direction. After I've cut my pattern pieces and I'm pinning them together to sew, I always lay out all of my pattern pieces in the order at which they have to be worn. So what I've done here is I've laid out my 2 front pieces. So I have a pair, so I have a left and a right, which is quite easy with this fabric because it's quite obvious that there's a right side and a wrong side. And then I would lay my back pieces on the top. By doing this, it makes sure that I have a full pair. So at a left and a right side, and they're prepped for me to take them over to the sewing machine or the overlocker to sew them up. If you're interested in my sewing methods and techniques, including industrial techniques, you can check out some of my other tutorials by hitting the subscribe button. Within those tutorials, I will have one of sewing these pants up using a quick 4-thread overlocker method. Thanks for joining me, and have fun with your pattern making and your sewing.